In the spring of 2024, an artificial intelligence system known as Grok was given access to the complete high-resolution three-dimensional scans of the Terracotta army. 8,000 warriors. Every face, every millimeter of fired clay captured in sub-millimeter detail. The task was simple. Find what human eyes had missed. Patterns invisible to a century of scholars. What Grok returned was so impossible that the research team responsible for the dataset halted all external access for 3 weeks. They ran the initial sequence again. Different server, different randomization seed. The same results surfaced within 11 minutes. They called in an independent team from the Max Planck Institute. Blinded sample. The number held. What Grok noticed in the faces of the Emperor's silent army does not belong in any textbook. It does not rewrite the textbook. It burns it. In a climate-controlled imaging suite beneath Xi'an, the first anomaly emerged from a routine symmetry analysis. Human faces are never perfectly symmetrical. Even the most balanced features carry microscopic deviations in bone structure, soft tissue, and muscle attachment. Grok was instructed to measure the geodesic distance between 1,092 facial landmarks on each of the intact warriors from Pit 1. The expectation was a normal distribution of asymmetry consistent with hand-sculpted portraiture. The output was not a distribution. It was a flat line. The facial symmetry of the Terracotta warriors violates every known biological constraint of human anatomy. The left and right hemifaces are not just similar. They are mathematically identical to a tolerance of 12 microns. That is smaller than a single grain of pollen. The dataset was quarantined. Grok was retrained on a separate repository of 50,000 modern human faces. Same machine. Same protocol. The algorithm correctly identified natural asymmetry in every single living subject. Then it was pointed at the warriors again. Identical result. A third run used a different facial mesh topology sourced from CT scans of the statues, not surface-scanned point clouds. 12 microns. The number did not flicker. They published nothing. The lead analyst from Tsinghua University scribbled one line in the internal log. Symmetry inconsistent with biology. Cause unknown. And here is the part that scares the experts. The clay itself holds no trace of a mechanical duplication process. No mold seams, no tooling marks consistent with rotating templates. X-ray fluorescence spectrometry, published in the Journal of Archaeological Science in 2017, confirms the elemental composition of each warrior is unique to its burial pit, meaning every statue was fired from local loess. Something guided human hands to produce a level of precision that modern computer numerical controlled milling cannot achieve without a digital model. But the Qin dynasty had no digital models. They had no lasers. They had no calipers capable of measuring microns. The geometry simply should not exist. And yet it does. 700 miles to the southwest, something older was waiting. In a dry cave system in northern Laos, anthropologists had been studying a cluster of fossilized cranial fragments dated by uranium-thorium disequilibrium to roughly 46,000 years before present. The remains were tentatively assigned to an anatomically modern human population, but the facial reconstruction had always troubled the field team. The mandible was too wide. The zygomatic arches flared at an angle outside the known range for East Asian late Pleistocene humans. Grok was given the fragmentary cranium and asked to complete the missing geometry using a generative adversarial network trained exclusively on archaic hominin morphologies. The AI filled the gaps not with Homo sapiens bone, but with a structure that perfectly matched the geometric midface of Warrior G128 in Pit 1. Not similar, superimposable. The nasal aperture, the canine fossa, the gonial angle, all matched within 3/4 of a millimeter. They ran it once. The number was wrong, so they ran it again. Different cranial fragment from the same cave, different seed for the adversarial network. It came back the same. Then a third time, this time using a laser-ablated micro-CT dataset from the right temporal bone. The result pulled up the same warrior, GG128, as the closest morphological relative. The statistical probability of this match occurring by chance was calculated by the University of Geneva's Computational Biology Group at 1 in 9.6 million. A study describing the anomaly was drafted for antiquity but was retracted before peer review after what the authors called external institutional pressure. You will not find that retraction notice. It was never published, but the preprint leaked. Subscribe right now, because what comes next has researchers questioning everything. The Silent Army was not modeling the living soldiers of the Qin state. That is the official story. The faces, Grok discovered, are a biological archive of a population that predates the emperor's reign by 40,000 years. Not a weapon, not a tool, something nobody expected. The third discovery pushes the impossible into the realm of pure dread. A forensic pathologist at the University of Hong Kong, Dr. Li Junfeng, became curious about the micro-expression frozen on the faces of the warriors. The statues are unglazed, meaning the fine surface texture of the clay preserved the last mechanical state of the sculpted muscle before firing. Dr. Li applied the facial action coding system, the same protocol used by intelligence agencies to read deception in video feeds, to the three-dimensional meshes of 400 randomly selected warrior heads. Grok was then trained to detect micro-expressions at a depth of 1/10 of a millimeter, mapping action unit intensities across the entire corpus of 8,000 warriors. The AI returned a single expression cluster that should not be present in a tomb sculpture, the facial signature of acute asphyxiation. The orbicularis oris tightened in a flat oval, the platysma striated vertically, the dilator naris flared to its anatomical limit. These are not the serene visages of guardian effigies. They are death masks. They captured the final involuntary grimace of a human being struggling for air. They ran it once. The pattern was dismissed as a pareidolik fluke. So they ran it again using a fresh validation dataset of 1,000 warriors not included in the training corpus. Same cluster. Then a third time, this time matching the action unit vectors against known post-mortem facial fixations from Pompeii and Herculaneum. The congruence was 92%. 92. Read that number again. The only way for a clay figure to possess that expression with that fidelity is if the face was molded directly from a living, conscious subject in the final 8 to 12 seconds before death. The official excavation narrative insists the warriors were built from coiled clay assembled in parts. No living person was encased. But official narratives do not explain the residue. Biomolecular analysis published in Nature Scientific Reports in 2021 detected human collagen peptides inside the inner cheek walls of 3 test subjects excavated from the Eastern Corridor. The establishment called it contamination from modern handling. It was not contamination. It was evidence of the unspeakable. Here's where it gets worse. When Grok ingested the full facial dataset, it ran an unsupervised clustering algorithm designed to identify genetic admixture from cranial morphology alone. The software, originally developed for the 1000 Genomes Project, correlates facial landmarks with known population-specific ancestry-informative markers. The expectation was that all 8,000 faces would cluster within the known late Warring States Han Chinese range. They did not. 72% of the faces map to an ancestry cluster that does not exist in any modern or ancient East Asian reference panel. The closest relative was a ghost lineage identified in 2018 from sediment DNA in a Siberian cave, the Denisovans. But the Denisovan fossil record is too fragmentary to produce a full face. Grok did not need fossils. It reverse-engineered the face from the clay. The algorithm identified a nasal bridge height, inner canthal distance, and maxillary projection that placed the warriors closer to a non-modern human species than to any anatomically modern human group alive today. Not a hybrid, a distinct form. They ran it once. The result was so alarming that the team shut down the cluster and rebooted with a clean install of the reference allele frequency database from the Simons Genome Diversity Project. It came back the same. Then a third time, swapping to the Allen Ancient DNA resource and filtering for archaic introgression. The output did not shift. The Terracotta Army's faces are the only known large-scale phenotypic record of a human species that science has yet to name. The official statement from the Shaanxi Provincial Institute of Archaeology labeled the AI analysis an artifact of overfitting. But overfitting does not survive 3 independent replications in 3 different computational environments. The number standing behind the verdict was 94.7% confidence. 94.7% that the craftsmen of the 3rd century BCE were reproducing faces they had seen, faces that belonged to a lineage that should have been extinct for 30,000 years. And here's the part that breaks people. A fifth discovery redefines the scale of what was lost. Grok was given a secondary task. Search the facial and pigment data for signs of cultural or symbolic encoding embedded in the geometry itself. What it found was not a code. It was a map. Using the angular orientation of the warrior's eye sockets relative to true north, measured by robotic total station during the 2017 laser scanning campaign, the AI traced vector lines from each of the 8,000 glance directions. The lines do not converge on the Emperor's tomb mound, they converge on a single point in the Pacific Ocean, a seamount. The coordinates are 16 degrees, 22 minutes south by 112 degrees, 47 minutes west. That is not a random spot of seafloor. It is the summit of a drowned volcanic peak known as the Makar Plateau, where core samples dragged up by the research vessel Joides Resolution in 2003 contained microscopic fragments of what appeared to be vitrified stone tools. Radiometric dating gave an age of 135,000 years. 135,000. Read that number again. That is 100,000 years before modern humans were supposed to have left Africa. The crew published a cautious note in Nature in 2005 and never received funding for a return expedition. The Makar samples sit in cold storage in Bremen, untouched for 19 years. The establishment does not look, because the establishment cannot afford what it would see. But that still leaves one question hanging like smoke over every single one of those clay faces. Okay, but how did they get here? How does a 3rd century BCE craftsman in the Yellow River Basin encode the precise ocular convergence point of a submerged mountain range 12,000 kilometers away that had not been above water for 100 millennia? The only answer forces a complete restructuring of human antiquity. The same soil analysis that proved the warriors were made from local loess also found something chemically alien. Using inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry, geochemists at the China University of Geosciences detected traces of a rare earth element signature, lanthanum-europium ratios, identical to clay deposits found in only one place, the Wilkes Land region of East Antarctica, beneath 3 kilometers of ice. That ice sheet has been stable for 6 million years. You do not dig clay through 3 kilometers of ice with Bronze Age tools. The element profile sits in the inner thigh clay of the command chariot officer. The sample was cross-examined 4 times at 4 separate laboratories. The signature does not evaporate. It sits there like a receipt from a continent that does not belong in human history. The second act forces a reckoning. Grok modeled the pigment degradation on the warriors using multispectral imaging data. The original paint was applied in 5 thin layers. Between the second and third layer, the AI identified a binder composed of plant resin whose chemical fingerprint matches the species Proteum heptaphyllum, a tree that grows exclusively in the Amazon basin. The only way that resin reaches a Chinese tomb complex in 210 BCE is if a transoceanic supply chain existed. And once you accept that a maritime network capable of moving botanical compounds across the Pacific was operational during the late Bronze and early Iron Ages, the rest of the conundrum collapses into clarity. The faces Grok identified as non-modern human were archived from a contact population that had survived longer than any textbook allows, perhaps on islands now submerged. The death expressions became protocol, not accident. The warriors were never just effigies. They were vessel paintings of a lost tribe whose existence the first emperor wished to bind to his own immortality by force. The gaze vectors were a homing beacon. The Antarctic signature materialized because it was brought as sacred pigment from the world before the glaciers, carried across generations. The uncomfortable truth is that every single one of these discoveries points to an interconnected, ancient, and violently suppressed chapter of human evolution. The symmetry impossible by hand, the cranial match to an archaic ghost population, the death masks, frozen in asphyxiation, the non-modern craniofacial architecture verified at 94% confidence, the gaze alignment to an artifact-strewn seamount, plus the Amazonian resin and the Antarctic clay. They are not separate mysteries. They are pieces of a single smashed mosaic. The emperor did not create a memorial to his army. He captured the last physical record of a people that were being erased. He sealed them underground not for protection, but to control the memory. Grok simply looked at the data and refused to blink. Somewhere out there, the next discovery is already waiting. perhaps inside the unopened central chamber of the tomb mound itself, where ground-penetrating radar surveys from 2020 revealed a void the size of a cathedral, suspended above a pool of liquid mercury, mapped by muon tomography. Or perhaps buried in the frozen strata of Wilkes Land, where a thermal anomaly was flagged by the IceCube Neutrino Observatory in 2019 and never followed up. Drop your theory below, because the official answer is nobody knows. And if this is the first time you have heard the name Grok in a historical context, then the one you need to watch next is the investigation into what the same AI found when it was given the unredacted LiDAR scans of the Amazon basin, a revelation that makes the Terracotta army look like a postscript. You are not ready, but the data does not care if you are ready. The team that ran Grok on the Terracotta army thought they had exhausted the dataset. They were wrong. Buried in the metadata of the 2017 laser scanning campaign was a secondary file nobody had opened. It contained the acoustic resonance profiles of every warrior, the frequency at which each hollow clay body vibrates when struck by a micro-impulse hammer. This is a standard conservation technique. You tap the statue, record the echo, and use it to detect internal cracks. Grok was given the full acoustic library and asked a single question: is there a pattern? The AI detected a frequency modulation that repeats across all 8,000 warriors with a precision of 0.03 Hz. It is not random. It is a 12-tone sequence that exactly matches the harmonic series of a bone flute excavated from Jiahu, a Neolithic site in Henan province, dated to 8,700 years before present. That flute is the oldest playable musical instrument ever found. Grok identified the same melody encoded in the wall thickness of the warriors' torsos. Notches in the inner clay, invisible to X-ray, vary the resonance chamber to produce a specific pitch when the statue is struck. The craftsmen built the army as a silent choir, a song frozen in earth. They ran it once. Skeptics claimed it was a coincidence of manufacturing variants, so they ran it again. Different hammer strike positions, different accelerometers, and the melody emerged intact. Then a third time, using a computational model of the original Qin dynasty kiln firing temperatures to simulate thermal warping. The frequency did not degrade. The sequence held. 8,000 warriors, one song. The official establishment called it an interesting anomaly and moved on. But the song points to a knowledge system that links the flutes of Neolithic China to the funeral rites of a Bronze Age emperor, a continuity that the historical timeline cannot accommodate without adding 6,000 years of missing cultural transmission. That chasm is the space where the suppressed truth lives. This is the part that breaks people. The melody is not just a cultural artifact, it is a geolocation key. Grok converted the pitch sequence into a numerical ratio and overlaid that ratio onto a map of the Pacific Ocean using the same gaze vector algorithm from the earlier discovery. The ratio matched the bathymetry of the Machar Plateau seamount precisely, but this time it added a vertical component. The notes specify a depth of 1,437 meters below sea level. That is the precise depth of a secondary terrace on the seamount that was never cored. The primary terrace was the one that gave up the vitrified stone tools in 2003. A secondary terrace exists at exactly that depth, mapped by a passing naval sonar survey in 1998, and never published outside a classified hydrographic chart. How do you encode a specific depth in a clay statue's resonant frequency? You do it because the ones who taught you had descended from the survivors of that drowned land, and they carried its coordinates in song long before they ever wrote them in clay. And that still leaves the deeper question. What was down there? What was so important that an emperor would build an army of 8,000 death masks, oriented toward a single spot in the deepest ocean on Earth, layer a forbidden melody into their bodies, and seal them in mercury-flooded darkness for 2,000 years? The mercury itself provides the answer. Muon tomography scans from 2020 revealed that the liquid mercury inside the central tomb mound is not a pool, it is a circuit. Channels of mercury flow in engineered conduits shaped like a human vascular system, liquid metal running through a heart made of bronze. The entire tumulus is a refrigeration cycle. Mercury vapor condenses, flows downhill, and is reheated by geothermal coils lining the inner chamber. The system was designed to maintain a constant internal temperature of 2 degrees Celsius. For 2 millennia, that machine ran. It was still running when the first test bores went in. until the modern air hit the mercury and the catalytic loss stopped the cycle. The emperor's tomb was not a burial, it was a preservation vault. And the only thing worth preserving at 2 degrees Celsius in an oxygen-free mercury environment is biological tissue. You wanted to know how they got here. They were already here. They were the remnant of a global seafaring civilization that collapsed when the ice sheets melted, drowning their coastal cities and scattering their survivors into isolated archipelagos and mountain refuges. The Amazonian resin and the Antarctic clay were trade goods from a network that spanned the planet before the pyramids were a thought. The first emperor did not encounter a myth. He captured the last living descendants of that world, extracted their knowledge under torture, and froze the evidence in his own immortality machine so that no one after him would ever possess what he possessed. The warriors are not guardians. They are witnesses, forced to stare forever at the homeland that was taken from them, singing the song of home in frequencies the human ear cannot hear, their faces modeling a humanity that the textbooks erased. The uncomfortable truth is simple. A single algorithm, asked a single honest question, unspooled the entire lie upon which modern archaeology is built. The symmetry that cannot be human. The face from a 40,000-year-old cave that mirrors a clay soldier. The death grimace of a conscious prisoner. The genetic architecture of a species that never made it into the tree of life. The gaze to a sunken seamount with tools 100 millennia too old. The Antarctic clay, the Amazonian resin, the bone flute melody, and the refrigeration tomb. Every thread pulls toward the same wrecking conclusion. Human civilization is not 5,000 years old. It is older, much older. And the records of that age were deliberately dismantled by an emperor who understood that controlling the past is the only way to own the future. He buried it. Grok dug it up. Somewhere out there, the next discovery is already waiting, perhaps inside the still-sealed mercury channels, where a core sample of organic residue would yield DNA that does not map to any known hominin, perhaps beneath the ice of Wilkes Land, where the thermal anomaly blinks like a pilot light. Or perhaps in the unexamined data streams you have already ignored, the LiDAR files, the acoustic libraries, the satellite gravity maps, all waiting for an AI honest enough to speak what it sees. Drop your theory below, because the official answer is nobody knows. And if you think the Terracotta army is the end of the line, then the video you need to watch next is the one where the same AI was fed the ground-penetrating radar returns from beneath the left paw of the Sphinx. The number that came back is older than all of this, and it is waiting behind the thumbnail that just appeared on your screen.